We have an impressive group of experts with us today to discuss issues that are pressing and important to the entire community, and they are the highest of priorities here at the Chicago Community Trust of what we are trying to address in the short term and the long term. So we are thrilled to have them. We will have discussions today about supporting homeownership and creating pathways to housing stability, how underutilized vacant land and abandoned properties can be assets that spur neighborhood development, and how to address public safety from a community level and work collaboratively on effective violence prevention efforts. We want this to be a real dialogue, but please recognize that we do want to be able to make sure that we have that our presenters are able to speak, but we do want you to participate with questions. There will be time after they've had time to speak. If you have a burning question that needs to be asked, I welcome you to raise your hand, because this is a dialogue, and because we're in person, we can have a dialogue. But we will be monitoring and making sure that we can get through this and get their voices heard as well as yours. So at this time, I'm pleased to introduce, or reintroduce for those of you who were at our last donor dialogue, Yana Kokoris, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the Trust, to provide some additional insight on these topics. Yana leads our government engagement and the Trust's local, state, and federal public policy strategy. She has a wealth of experience, most recently with the University of Chicago's Office of Civic Engagement. Her resume includes leadership positions at some familiar organizations like the MacArthur Foundation, Pew Charitable Trust, Metropolitan Planning Council, and a variety of roles, all involving policy and research. So, Yana, I'll hand it to you.
Great, thanks, Bob. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. Thanks for allowing me to be on this donor dialogue panel again today. It's a real privilege to be able to do this work with our colleagues in philanthropic services, as well as our many partners, some of whom are represented here on the panel today. We wanted to provide a little bit of framing and overview for why these three topics and why these three topics together, and really exemplify how these three integrated approaches really help us move towards our strategic vision of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, and really focusing at the household level, the neighborhood level, and at the community level. So first, why homeownership? Homeownership and owning a home has been the cornerstone of how individuals, families build wealth over generations, and it helps anchor families' long-time economic security. And it generates wealth for current and future generations. But we know that there remain significant gaps in homeownership across race and ethnic groups. And some of the statistics are up here. I won't recite them. But these factors have not necessarily improved for quite some time. And so we're very much focused on that. But owning a home is not enough in helping to build wealth. And for those homes to have intergenerational value, they also have to have and exist in thriving neighborhoods. And unfortunately, in many neighborhoods that are predominantly Black or Latinx communities, there is far too much vacant land in these communities, and it detracts from the neighborhood's value. And it is often seen as blight. An analysis in 2016 by Cityscape Chicago found that there are more than 30,000 vacant parcels in Chicago, and about half of them are owned by the city. But it's sort of ironic to say, but in many ways we can look at vacant land as an asset. There's many underutilized properties, and it's an opportunity that we have to reactivate those properties in the city and in Cook County more broadly. Our colleague Mike Davidson talks about how real the challenges are, including tax delinquency, absentee ownership, pollution, blight, and crime. They also provide that baseline ingredient of wealth creation, which is land. Finally, community safety. we are all aware of the alarming rate of crime and violence in our region. And it is a public health crisis that affects all of us. But it does disproportionately impact Black and Latinx communities. And unfortunately, the pandemic, as we've all experienced, has exacerbated and further destabilized our region, and particularly communities of color, as well as the violence that is happening there. So we really believe that closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap cannot be achieved if we don't address these intersecting issues. And violence in particular is both a cause and consequence of these economic inequities that we are seeing. So as we've thought about our strategic focus of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, heading into this year, we really looked across our body of work, and there were 3 issues, the ones that we're discussing today, that we felt were emerged as cross-cutting. They cut across all of our strategies. You may be familiar with our strategic plan, which really thinks about how do we grow individual and household wealth, catalyze neighborhood investment, build collective power, and addressing critical needs. These issues touch all elements of that strategy, and they all have policy implications. And there are near-term opportunities to advance these goals together and ensure that we make long-term meaningful change. But there's a risk if we don't prioritize these right now. And so we want to really focus on coming out of the pandemic, and as we focus on an equitable recovery, how can we continue to reduce inequities that undergird the wealth gap and ensure that they don't get worse in light of the pandemic? And how can we leverage the significant federal resources that are flowing into the city and the region to both ensure an equitable recovery, but propel action on these priorities that we've outlined today? So over the last several months, the Trust has been working to understand how these federal dollars are coming in and how can they reach communities most in need. So while the scale of federal investment sounds like a lot, we're talking billions of dollars coming to the city and county, it is a one-time opportunity to create longer-term systemic change. And this is an opportunity that we think that we both need to be thinking about where those dollars are going in the short term, but how we think about the systems and the ways that those dollars flow into communities and who has access to those resources. So again, this is true of all the areas we're talking about today. For vacant land, the city has allocated $5 million to vacant land remediation, but we know it can't stop there. It's thinking about how the city works to return those properties to an active use. There are hundreds of millions of dollars that have been allocated to housing assistance, mostly for emergency rental assistance. And I think there's significant opportunities there to think about how we can better address housing instability for renters. But very little of those dollars have been allocated to homeownership. The city allocated some resources for down payment assistance, but we also need to be thinking about how do we prevent any future loss of homeownership, particularly for those small landlords who have renters who may not have been able to be paying rent for the last couple of years, and ensure that they don't fall into foreclosure and we lose both the wealth opportunity for that family as well as the affordable housing supply. In terms of community safety and violence reduction efforts, the city and the county have both dedicated a significant amount of resources, as well as the state. We'll hear from Chris later today about those resources, upwards of $170 million for those efforts. So we are at the Trust both advocating for how these dollars can be directed and implemented toward uses that are crucial to an equitable recovery, and we are directing our own grant resources to support efforts by nonprofits and governments to be better equipped to implement these dollars that are flowing in and ensure that they reach communities that have been most impacted and underinvested for generations. So the partners we have here today will help illuminate what these opportunities are and how some of the work they've been doing for years is now well positioned to take advantage and leverage these opportunities and create catalytic and meaningful change over the long term. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and helping identify how your philanthropic support could help advance these aims. I'll hand it back over to Bob.
So there's no challenge at all to put all of this information in the next 45 to 50 minutes, but we will do our best. What I will do is provide a quick introduction and then tee up some questions so that each of our panelists can share their wisdom and insight with us. First, Eleanor Gorski is the executive director of the Cook County Land Bank Authority. And this is the largest, which I did not know, the largest land bank in the U.S. And if I'm correct, more than 1,700 properties that are part of the land bank. The work involves expanding inventory to create more affordable housing and economic opportunity in Cook County and returning vacant properties to productive use in underserved communities. They partner with community developers, small businesses, and with prospective home buyers. Sharon Lagenza is the executive director of Housing Action Illinois, which is a statewide coalition formed to protect and expand the availability of quality, affordable, accessible housing throughout Illinois. She's been the executive director since 2008. That's when I came here to the trust, so we've got almost 14 years here. Sharon forges partnerships among housing counseling agencies, homeless service providers, affordable housing developers, and fair housing groups, and and routinely presents on a variety of affordable housing and homeless prevention topics, with engaging with state and federal decision makers, with financial institutions to promote equitable community development policies and initiatives. Quite a task. Finally, Chris Patterson is the Assistant Secretary of the Illinois Office of Firearm Prevention in the Department of Human Services in the state of Illinois. So Chris's resume includes time as, Chief Program Officer at the Friends of Children, Chicago, an organization that provides children facing the greatest obstacles with professional mentors. Chris also served as Senior Director of Programs and Policy for the Institute for Nonviolence, Chicago. He's been a thought partner and implementer to Chicago's largest violence intervention efforts, including Ready Chicago, Community Partnering for Peace. Chris also worked as a community organizer for Ceasefire Illinois, which I would guess that most of us know that. He was program manager with One Northside, and then later as Associate Director of Organizing for the Community Renewal Society. So quite a resume, quite a wealth of experience to share with us today. So we will address this challenge of having three community leaders whose issues and messages merit full donor dialogues all by themselves. But we will do our best to give them time to share their wisdom and their advice and then respond to your questions. So I'll start with you, Sharon. With interest rates rising and some of the housing assistance programs enacted during the pandemic winding down and coming to a close, what are some of the current opportunities for homeownership?
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I want to start by sharing some good news, because I think that coming into this, there's a lot of challenges right now that we face, not just in housing, but across the board in terms of community economic development. But Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies issues every year a report, The State of the Nation's Housing, and they just issued it last week, I think, or the week before. And they reported that households of color accounted for half of the total growth in homeowners between early 2016 and early 2022. And an even larger share at 55% of the increases over the past 2 years. So when we think about closing the racial wealth gap through homeownership, we are making tangible progress, right? And I think that's the message I want to share, is that there are definitely headwinds. And we know them through supply issues, right? Construction costs are incredibly high, increasing the cost of new construction. But we also have other supply issues that I'll mention in a bit. And we also have interest rates that are going up. But I think that there are things that we can do and continue to do on a systems level that it benefits individual households. And that's kind of what I'm here to talk about. In my limited time, I wanted to lay the table a little bit, talk a little bit about the challenges, and then talk about two solutions in which we partner with Philanthropy and others. One is policy advocacy and public education, and the second is housing counseling support and capacity building. So first I want to say, like, why is this? Why are we in this state? Why are we dealing with the racial wealth gap and home ownership? And I am kind of curious about people's knowledge of the history of redlining and how we ended up here. I was going to say, do people know when I say redlining? Do people have a sense of what I'm talking about? Okay, great. That's kind of the touchstone in which we move from. And the reason why it has to be the touchstone is because redlining was official government policy that was also enacted by private industry to limit housing choice of particularly Black households, right? So as American was growing, the middle class was growing, and people were buying houses and suburbs were being built, whole sectors of the United States, because of race, were excluded from that. And so we think that we have to always ground ourselves in that history and understand that if that was some of the root causes, then they have to be part of the solution, right? No one gets a pass. It's not necessarily individual choice or people aren't saving enough or whatever. There's systems level solutions to this that I'd like to share. But I also want to say, so I don't want to be too Pollyanna about this, right? Because we know that there are challenges right now. I mentioned the supply issue. But another big topic that we're thinking about, and I'll be curious with the land bank, is the role of investors in real estate. The Washington Post had a story just a few months ago that showed that investors are really targeting majority Black neighborhoods to purchase single-family homes. And they said that in 2021, 30% of the homes bought in majority Black zip codes were by investors versus 12% in other zip codes. So when investors buy to either convert to rental or to upgrade and sell at a higher price, that doesn't necessarily mean that that equity is staying in the neighborhood, right? They could be absentee landlords, or they could be pricing out, kind of current residents. So this is a topic that, is something that we'll be looking for going forward in terms of solutions. But I think that we have to think about the role of private investors in terms of limiting the supply. But, and then I'm sorry, the final thing I wanted to mention was interest rates. We all know that interest rates have gone up and mortgage rates have not quite doubled. I think they've gone up maybe 2 to 3 percentage points over the last 4 or 5 months. And the practical impact of that is that it prices out low and moderate income households, right? The more you have to pay for a mortgage, the less mortgage you can afford, or you should afford, depending on your budget. And Harvard kind of ran the numbers for me, and they said the impact on monthly mortgage payments of the 2 percentage point hike in interest rates between late December and mid-April is equivalent to that of a 27% jump in home prices, right? So the headwinds are strong. Home ownership still continues. I think that what we have to think about is how are we going to influence systems to make sure that those who are ready to purchase can still purchase. And I want to mention just some trends that we're seeing. So Housing Action Illinois, we're something called a HUD-approved housing counseling intermediary. And what that means is that HUD has recognized us as kind of a pass-through funder for housing counseling agencies in the region. And so we get money from HUD and we pass it through, but we work really closely with our affiliates. And comparing October 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021, that's the period. So those 6 months from 2020-21 and then 2021-22, we've seen about a quarter decrease in individuals purchasing homes after housing counseling. That's one of the indicators that we track. So, we're a little bit concerned that we're seeing this decrease in individuals being able to purchase. And the majority of people being served are low income and households of color. At the same time, during those same two comparative periods, we've seen about a 10% increase in people seeking default counseling or how to avoid a foreclosure. So again, 10%, a lot of foreclosures and defaults were held off because of COVID resources, but that's a figure that we'll be watching very carefully and making sure our housing counseling agencies are ready to serve those clients, as well as talking to financial institutions and government entities about forbearance programs or loan modifications, things along that line. So 2 areas of opportunity I mentioned, state and federal policy advocacy. And I have to say that there's some significant successes in Illinois. The first one I want to talk about is the Community Reinvestment Act. So when I say CRA or Community Reinvestment Act, do people know what I'm talking about? Okay, so CRA there's a federal Community Reinvestment Act. It's part of the civil rights packages that this was passed in the 70s. And it regulates banks and requires them to make credit available in all of the communities where they do business. So that means that they cannot redline and not serve low-income communities or not serve majority Black or majority Latinx communities. And CRA has made a difference, the federal CRA, but it hasn't clearly solved the problem. So over the last few years, there's been an opportunity to comment on regulatory reform of the federal CRA. And we're in the process of that right now. The big thing there is because of advocacy and support by the trust for us to lead a coalition, the federal regulators are express about the need to have CRA address racial equity, right? So we're using this as a way to leverage conversations with financial institutions about their role in making credit available in all communities, including communities of color. But the big success was we were able to pass a state CRA. And the relevance here is that the federal CRA covers kind of what we would consider traditional banks. The state CRA covers state-regulated banks, credit unions, as well as mortgage brokers. And that last category is key because 70% of mortgages nationwide are done through mortgage brokers now. They're online banks, right? Very few of us go to a bank branch. And so we're in the rulemaking process right now, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to have strong rules to make sure that banks, credit unions, and mortgage brokers are serving the needs of all communities, and particularly communities of color. I don't know how much time I have. So then the other role of advocacy, I would say, isn't so much to ask like philanthropy to provide like down payment assistance, right? The role we play is we go to banks and we say, where's your down payment assistance fund? Or we go to government and say, out of those dollars, how much are going to COVID impacted neighborhoods, right? So we work really closely with state agencies, with financial institutions as, I wouldn't say watchdog, but as kind of a voice of community, right? To say, don't forget about these places. We need to prioritize certain places. And then the final thing is housing counseling support and capacity building. I don't know how many people know when I say housing counseling what that is. So housing counseling, they're not-for-profit, community-based organizations that provide financial education and other types of group or one-on-one counseling for people who have a variety of housing-related issues or needs. So housing counseling agencies really are kind of, can be a really great welcome center for people, first-generation home buyers, for example, who may not know what the whole home purchase process is. So there's something called pre-purchase education. There's also post-purchase education. So now you have a house. What do you do? How do you budget to make sure for repairs? And then there's like foreclosure and default mitigation counseling. Those are 3 big areas. And housing counseling, they're kind of on the front lines of helping people in the neighborhood make sure that they can keep their house, can access homeownership. And I think one way philanthropy can help is by supporting these agencies, supporting kind of the capacity of these agencies to serve more people in their neighborhoods, because they're really kind of that trusted, neutral source. And then I would just say the final thing around a story about being patient and the role of housing counseling and the reason why there's hope is, we have this story of a client who went to one of the housing counseling agencies in Chicago, Lucha, and she thought she wanted to buy a house, and she actually wasn't qualified. So she ended up on a plan to reduce her debt. And so after a number of years, she worked to reduce her debt to just $300. And then she went to a pre-purchase education class again. And she was actually able to qualify for a mortgage and ended up purchasing a house. Now that took a number of years, but she was ready at that time then. She wasn't overburdened with debt. And the person's chance of staying in that house has been increased significantly because of that. So I think that that's what I wanted to say. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So let's segue to Eleanor. And how can we start to view vacant land and abandoned buildings not as blight, but as opportunity? How do we put them to use as community assets? What's the role of the Cook County Land Bank Authority in these efforts?
Yes, okay. I'd like to start and say that my background, I'm an architect, and I worked for the City of Chicago Department of Planning for over 20 years. And in that role, I headed the Chicago Landmarks Commission, and I also worked with developers in every neighborhood in the city. So I'm going to caveat this by saying I've not met a building or a vacant lot I didn't like, but I couldn't find something to do with it. And I think the key to this that I have found through my years of work is really listening to the community. And when you say, how can we view these as assets, I think we need to change where we're viewing them from. So piggybacking on the redlining, I also want to add contract buying and everything else we know historically has gone into Chicago. Just picture growing up in one of these neighborhoods. That's the legacy that you are saddled with, right? And you know your neighbors, you know there's good things happening in the neighborhood. Just folks from the outside don't see that. So what I see as a key to the land bank and what we have done, and remember, it's not just Chicago, it's all over Cook County that we do work. So it includes some of the most poor suburbs like Robbins and Dolton and other mostly southern suburbs. There are core folks in those communities who are doing good work, and we need to support them. So that's what the Cook County Land Bank does. And that includes homeowners, potential homeowners. It also includes elected officials that may not have capacity to think beyond, how am I going to get the garbage picked up next week? We don't have enough tax revenue. It's also supporting small businessmen or entrepreneurs who want to open a business in their neighborhood, and they may not have any idea how to do that, but they see a vacant building. It also includes developers who see vacant houses in the neighborhood where they live or where they're developing, and they don't know how to get capital to expand their business beyond doing one building at a time, or they don't know how to get control of these properties that are bringing down the rest of the block where they're starting to make progress. So I think that's the beauty of the organization I now work for, the Land Bank, is that we're quasi-governmental. It was created by Cook County, but it was deliberately created as a separate authority so we could cross all these boundaries, city, other municipalities throughout Cook County, but also partnering with the folks that you see here. And I'm so excited that I think the main point, the main area that I can see philanthropy, one, is bringing us all together. And I have to give a lot of kudos to the trust that I worked with slightly at City Hall. They've been instrumental in the work that we're all talking about here today and bringing me into rooms that I hadn't been in, and I think the Land Bank needs to be in. And conversely, I'm bringing them into neighborhoods and meeting community members, and they're providing support, and they're providing kind of a knowledge base and a support system for these community groups, these municipalities that may not have the resources to address these issues. And then I would say the other thing that I'm really focused on at the land bank is I just see a lack of capital to get these projects done. And that is really for small developers to tackle real construction projects to scale up. The land bank has over 400 small community developers. Many of these are people of color. They are also women. And those fly under the radar. And the trust was, again, great in sponsoring a developer women's breakfast that we had. And we kind of form a cohort, an informal cohort of these developers. And that's where I see philanthropy, not just supporting the education, but also supporting in a fund. And specifically, I'm looking at a fund that is geared towards land bank developers, people of color, to scale up their businesses and to provide financing for projects, and it will recycle back in and support other developers. Detroit established a similar fund when they went through the foreclosure crisis. It's been tremendously successful. So that's the model that we're looking at. The other thing that I can add is just the continuing dialogue among the different agencies. We all laugh about the city of Chicago and how one department doesn't talk to another. That's true, but also just county and other agencies don't talk to each other. So again, a big role for philanthropy. So I'm happy to answer questions about the specific plans that the land bank has for tackling these, but I just want to leave you with those two thoughts.
Chris, Yana mentioned cause and consequence. There's this juxtaposition of what causes something, what is the consequence. And I think, as we segue away from housing and vacant lands to community safety and violence, that's got to be at the forefront of we look and what are the root causes, what are the consequences here, and so I would pose a question to you that obviously the prevalence of violence in our community is a major concern, I would imagine, for everyone in this room and everyone in our communities. So why is it then important to reframe our thinking about public safety as a community issues? And are there proven effective community approaches to addressing violence?
I think that's a great question, and good afternoon, everyone. So we went through, let's say, my resume of work, but I think the part that's missing for many communities is being heard. This idea that the community members who are impacted by firsthand experiences, and sometimes those experiences can be devastating. These are the voices typically not heard, right? And so as policies have been created, and I come from a family like that, I'm a victim of gun violence, I have lived experience in other categories. And I want to make it so that the work that we're doing out of the Office of Firearm Violence Prevention is a learning institution. And I think that we've done that really well, in philanthropy. Government needs to catch up to that. The question of what and how root causes contribute to that, right, is that policies are typically made by individuals who don't necessarily have those lived experiences. And so having folks at the table who can say, listen, when someone shoots someone, it is what we're looking at from the Office of Firearm Violence Prevention's perspective is obviously the accountability that has to take place, right? So we're not saying folks should get a free pass when violence happens. But we are pushing ourselves to think deeper around, why wasn't that individual in school? Why wasn't this individual working? What is this, the dynamics that is going on in the community, et cetera? It's really forcing us to understand that, violence it's larger than the conflict between two individuals. If you all in the room have been advocates and champions of violence reduction work for the last 6+ years, and I think I would be preaching to the choir to try to educate you on any of those components. What I do see as one of the main characteristics of the work that we're doing is that 10 years ago, we were just trying to get people jobs as a violence reduction strategy, if we think about it, right? So let's get them jobs, let's keep folks busy. Now we're talking about mental health, right? And if you're not talking about addressing trauma and mental health in young people and people impacted by firearm violence, then you're really not even talking firearm violence reduction language. And so the evolution of where we're going, I really appreciate the direction in which we're going, but it is rooted in addressing the root cause of why a thing happens. And one of the things, and I'll digress, is the Reimagined Public Safety Act, which created the Office of Firearm Violence Prevention, which was passed by the governor last year. It is rooted, and the foundation is there's the streamline of addressing trauma, addressing communities, vacant lots, right? If you read the Reimagined Public Safety Act, it goes way beyond let's address just the conflicts that happen between individuals, but more so the root cause of why the things are happening in the first place.
I know some of you have addressed this, but and this is to any of, and all three of you, to what extent do you see opportunities, and some you've addressed it a little bit, but some concrete ideas for partnerships and collaborations between philanthropy, the public sector, the private sector, to address these seemingly impossible challenges?
I can tackle that. So part of our strategic plan for the land bank is focusing first on which areas of the city and the suburbs already have plans in place for what they'd like to do. For the city, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's Invest Southwest, and Mayor Lightfoot's signature program, where she is focusing on certain areas of the south and west side. And I was able to work on that prior to my land bank job, so I'm familiar with those neighborhoods. The city's putting in key investments in those corridors. So I see that the role of land bank and private industry philanthropy is to build on those nodes and build out. And in addition to the land bank land that we can supply, I also see it our role to make sure people are actually successful once we give them the land. It doesn't sit there again. And that's a very important part of our policy. So I'm selling a property that's an old bank building to a local developer in the Washington Park neighborhood. And as part of that project, we are making sure that he has the funding to complete the project, that what he wants to put in that building is meeting neighborhood plans. It's going to be co-working space on the top floor, a food hall on the bottom floor. And kitty corner from that are city and private non-profit investments in housing, as well as a health center. So I see that all working together to achieve stability in a commercial corridor. And then further, the land bank and the city have vacant lots in the neighborhood surrounding it. Second phase is marketing those lots. City will market them for affordable housing. I will market land bank lots for market rate housing. So we're building a mixed neighborhood around this commercial corridor. So we have many income levels to support the new commercial that is being built there in those services. So that's how I see it, of us all working together. And then for violence prevention, we also have land in areas that are beset by violence. And I'm working with the Department of Public Health with the city. They have federal funds to control that land and figure out, how do we lock it down? It's not putting housing in there, because we need to start from square one there. It's a different solution. And it's also a different funding stream. Once we have a plan there, it's then bringing in private development once they feel secure that there is a plan and that there is funding there and that they can now start to invest. So I think we're more at a starting point, at least from where I stand with vacant land, and I'm talking mostly West Side. Yeah.
I appreciate that. And if I could add, so I'm thinking about three things. Someone help me so I don't lose track of my mind. Is capacity building, getting the word out, and data. All right, so those are my three things, just in case I lose. Yeah, that was a challenge. I'm like, where's the pen and paper? Like, I need to write stuff down. All right, so capacity building. Again, Chicago Community Trust, philanthropy partners across Chicago really carry the torch as it pertains to violence reduction for the last 6-7 years in Chicago. And without, the work of philanthropy, violence reduction wouldn't be on the table as it stands right now as a major priority for the state, city, and county per funding. And so definitely hats off. It was great. Don't pull back quite yet, right? And so we want to make sure that philanthropy stays attached and tethered to this fight. It's going to take all of us continually to go into this work. For a little recap, there's $250 million from my office to address firearm violence across the state. That's funding 33 communities within Chicago, 1 through 33 for rate and volume, and then 16 municipalities across the state. So we're working right into making sure that we're addressing firearm violence wherever it's an epidemic. So staying involved inside or at the table as it pertains to the conversation around reducing firearm violence, that's necessary. What you built in the past few years was outreach, case management, victim service, and others work, but is shown to be very effective at reducing firearm violence. Now what we're seeing is organizations, now that the city, county, and state are involved, capacity building for organizations that may in the past not have gotten or qualified to have gotten state funding, getting them to the table, administratively teeing them up and allowing them to stand on their own, right? So capacity building now is one of the biggest issues I'm seeing with particularly smaller providers in those neighborhoods that are doing the grassroots on the ground work. The second part is getting the word out. We did a survey after our first round of funding. We did a second round of funding starting May 2nd, and we did something very unique in the state, and we did an open notice of funding opportunity. And that meant we did not put a cap date or an end date towards those applicant submissions. And the reason we did that is because some of the things that we were hearing from surveyors or folks who were providers who were looking for funding was data restrictions, right? So folks are always going to have some issues with registering. The other part was they just didn't know that the state was finally in the fight. They didn't know that there was violence prevention money to this degree. So I think in this capacity, reaching out to partners and or providers on your end, letting them understand and know that there are, land-based solutions. There are violence reduction efforts going on, right? And they can reach out to their city, county, and state partners. And I'm going to need the help. What did I say was the third?
Data.
All right, so good. Thank you very much. I wanted to bring some humor to this thing. All right. The other part is there's an intergovernmental working group that we've created recently since last year that involves the city, county, and state. And, Lynetta Haynes, who is the chief of staff for President Preckwinkle. You've got Tamara Hall and Mahal and some folks at the city, my office, and then ICJ. We're all sitting together at least twice a week. Let's say at least once a week, sometimes often twice a week. The conversation that we're having is there's going to be a real dilemma that's going to hit providers, and we want to think about providers because we don't want to cause them undue stress, is that what happens during reporting time, right? Our providers who are going to get multiple streams of funding, right, particularly from, say, violence prevention spaces, are they going to have to do 2, 3, 4, and maybe 5 different reports in order to, kind of back up their work? And so we're working on a joint data process part where we can kind of extract our information, but only one report needs to get it. Now, it's not final, but we are working in that direction. And I would encourage philanthropy to also, particularly philanthropy that has their hand in violence reduction work, to also get in this conversation with us and think, holistically around like how do we create a reporting structure and or structure that doesn't put so much strain on our providers who are doing the on the ground work. So it's a little bit in the forecast, but some of the things that I'm thinking about.
Sharon, I don't want to cut you off, but I want to open this to questions. We've got plenty of follow-up questions if you are, for some reason, silenced here. But we hope that you've got some questions, so please raise your hand. Yes, Stephen.
Could you address land-based failures? I read recently, for instance, all the moved out of the south side.
Say that those are not land bank projects that you mentioned, but I'm happy to talk about that because to me, it's a planning failure. I was at the Department of Planning when the Englewood project happened. And I think that too often the mindset, and I will say that everyone's learning as we go, right? You're testing these things out. We don't have a crystal ball. So I think at the time, the thought was, let's create anchors in the neighborhoods and then private development will just fall into place. I think what we've learned that doesn't happen. So the example that I gave with the last question, that build out the commercial strip more thoroughly, then bring in housing to support it. In my estimation, the Whole Foods failure was partially because we didn't increase the density around that development to help support it. And then from the density, you also need to have a variety of income levels. And they can be there. I know they can be there from the work that we've done, where there are middle-class folks that want to move back to those neighborhoods, but there's not the school to support them. There are violence issues, there's crime issues. So it's a wraparound approach that we need to do so that those dollars that we are investing aren't just thrown away. So I think we're changing that. But for land bank failure specifically, I have to say that there are very few because the land bank hasn't been bold. I'm trying to make it bold. So we'll see. I'll talk to you in 2 years and see, and then we can talk about my failures. But we really have been under the radar with dealing with individual properties and developers. And that has been a terrific approach because we've built up, again, over 400 small developers throughout Cook County who do this work. But that's not enough to tackle this problem. And I think it really needs, again, to be a bigger approach with partners for us to make a dent in what we're all talking about.
It's going to be all yours.
Does anybody else have a question? I've got a question for you
now.
then,
Look out.
Chris. What kind of an impact will the recent Supreme Court decision on the Second Amendment have for your organization or for what you're trying to do? Or will it have any impact at all?
So Illinois, or not Illinois, but Chicago, where the majority of violence for Illinois happens, as you all know, some of the strictest, gun laws there are in the country. So I'm not exactly sure how this is going to play out as it pertains to Illinois, the decision that was made. But we do have this influx and this crisis of guns that flood into obviously Illinois from our neighboring states. But I know in back channels and behind the scenes there are interagency, intergovernmental or governmental conversations and task force created to really get to the root of how do we address the fact that we're pouring in from Indiana, Wisconsin, and some of our other bordering states. So I'm not exactly sure how that new ruling is going to play out in our particular work, but right now it's there's already max penalties for individuals who are caught with guns who shouldn't have guns, i.e., with criminal records and other barriers. But I'm not exactly sure what that's going to see. Well, right now, just by default, over the years, it's been a very gun restricted, area, and so, folks are not buying guns legally in Chicago, right? It's always outside of our, our jurisdictions that those guns are coming in.
My question's for Eleanor. Could you talk a little bit about the marketing of available properties?
Marketing is all done online. but for large commercial properties where we hire commercial brokers. And we do have, and this is mainly in the suburbs, but we do have commercial properties as well as industrial properties. And this has been recent that the land bank has gotten into that. Historically, the land bank had mostly dealt with residential properties. But the reason why we market online is so that everyone has a chance to see the properties that we have as a public agency. That's very important. And we also open up bidding every other month for half of our inventory. So anyone can go online, see what's available at a particular time, and put in a bid for a property. Again, the nice thing about the land bank is we receive many of our properties for next to nothing. There's just the legal costs and processing the deeds and the paperwork. So price is not our prime deciding factor on who we sell these properties to. We have a scorecard where we look at capacity of whoever's buying it, that they can finish what they say they want to do with it. It agrees with community plans, that they are from the community. And I think someone here was talking about out-of-state investors. We will not sell to anyone that's out of state. And in fact, we go very centric to the neighborhood. If we have a property in Dolton, we want you to be from Dolton, or then the south suburbs, or then from Cook County. That's literally how we go through our applications. So sometimes we get criticized for being very slow, but that's why we want to make sure we don't have a failure rate and that we're really serving the needs of the people in the community.
Hi, thank you all for speaking to us. I have a kind of two fairly specific questions. My organization, Forging Opportunities for Refugees in America, is currently in process of buying one of those 14,000 city properties that's been vacant. And it has been enormously difficult to surmount the issue in terms of aldermanic privilege. And I'm wondering, how is it that you get properties into your wonderful, transparent, accessible process when it was literally, I can't even describe to you how difficult and corrupt the process seems to be. And then finally, we've got this wonderful big property. It's much bigger than our current programming. We're in a neighborhood that could kind of go either way in terms of the violence. What would you recommend would be a great use of a big public building space that would help prevent violence in the future in our community?
Yeah, I think I can answer that.
I can at least give you some hint on the aldermanic prerogative. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development is actually looking at Chicago's aldermanic prerogative as a Fair Housing Act violation. I don't know where their investigation is right now, but that is something. And if you want, I can put you in touch with folks who are working with HUD on that. So
can I just tag on to that? So the We Will Chicago plan was actually done to help address that HUD investigation, because it was recognized that we need a more equitable plan for the city. So the last time I heard, that plan was meant to address some of these shortcomings. But in reality, I was just checking the time. And to answer your question, so I'll make this quick so Chris can go. So I mentioned at the beginning, the land bank's an individual authority. Best thing ever, because I can go to aldermen and tell them, thank you for your input, but these are the rules set by my board. We're an independent authority, and we have the support of the community group. Where that gets tricky is if there is a local zoning change, or even in the suburbs, we need to process different tax stamps. So what the land bank has set up is a memorandum of understanding with the different entities so that we're able to kind of have rules of the road. I'm still working through those in my relatively short tenure at the land bank. But for City of Chicago, I want to make a difference between what the land bank owns and the city owns. So the city process is very cumbersome because it is dealing with the aldermen, elected officials, this built-in process. At the land bank, we can close on land between 6 and 8 weeks once we receive an offer and it's processed. So what we did in March is we entered into an agreement with the City of Chicago Department of Planning and Housing that we can form a partnership and assemble our land together and then work through these issues so we can close more quickly. So I'd be happy to talk to you about your project after this, and we can see if there's something that we can do and process it through the land bank. I don't know how far along you are, but or I can find you another property. So. Okay, so Chris, I'll hand that over.
Final word. And for the Office of Firearm Violence Prevention, you can go to our website, idhs/OFVP, which is for Office of Firearm Violence Prevention. There we'll identify the multiple communities in which we're funding. And we've identified the providers who we're working with in each one of those communities under youth development, violence prevention, and high-risk youth development. So in that event, if you have a building that is in one of those locations under the Reimagine Public Safety Act, those providers can be there to support. And I would love to make any connections that you would need for those communities to bring additional resources. So thank you.
So this was, I thought, a very daunting challenge. And I see, just to wrap here, taking us back to Jana with your the graphic that was up on the screen with the kind of the Venn diagram of how all of this interplays. I think I'm thrilled that the way that the three of you presented, you've taken that to heart and shown. Sharon, you said early that no one gets a pass. The folks that were involved in redlining, involved in the legitimate, at the time, methods of preventing people from home ownership. And then bringing it to Eleanor, with you saying that, we get to the table with the developers because they are key to this, and getting them to cooperate and collaborate instead of in this competing environment. And then Chris, to me, you bring it all together with, you talk about the absolute importance that these community voices need to be heard. And I think what they've done is they've described the table where everyone needs to be sitting. And everyone needs to have a voice. There is the whole idea of DEI. There's the inclusion part, and then there's the impact of that inclusion. And that's when it happens, when the voices get heard, those that know the solutions. And also, I think one of you said that there are already things that work. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. You need to get back to the root of what the solutions are and how to work together. And I am just so thankful that all three of you have touched on that. You've weaved it into the conversation. And so I would just like us all to applaud Eleanor and Sharon and Chris for the presentations. So as we wrap up, there are surveys in front of you. If you do have time, please fill those out. You can expect an email tomorrow with more information. We hope that it'll include the website that Chris gave, as well as other helpful information about the three organizations and what they are doing. We also want to hold up organizations that are doing the good work. I think, who talked about the neighborhood counseling? Sharon, that there will be organizations that, here's your call to action, that if you're moved, if you're inspired by what they're talking about here, there are a lot of options. Talk to me, talk to Nicole, your philanthropic advisors, anyone here at the Trust, and we can help provide you with the resources that, if you want to make an impact, you want to make a difference, and support an organization that is promoting and following what the three here have been talking about, then that's our call to you. That's our plea to you that you can step up and get involved. Let's see. One of the things that I can say is that later on this year, our community impact team is planning to host a series of roundtable discussions around home ownership. So watch for alerts. If you do want to dive deeper and learn more, our community impact team will we'll be hosting these discussions later in the year. We also will launch an open call for organizations to secure funding to build their capacity and utilize these federal recovery funds. We didn't go deeply into the pipeline and how it's going to be working. Jana touched on it, but there will be a lot of work to make sure that these funds that come in are put in the right place and spent wisely. There will be more donor dialogues, so we hope that you'll watch your emails for invitations to an upcoming donor dialogue in the fall. And last of all, I hope that you can stick around for 5, 10, 15 minutes if you do have one-on-one questions, that we will stay here. And again, thank you for showing up. Thank you for participating. And we hope you have a great rest of your week.